What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting organized crime discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet. We're living under rock and seeing this video for the first time. I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit down video. I do want to let you guys all know if you enjoy cigars, go check out my friends at Pravada Cigar Club. Get your hands on exclusive and curated cigars and elevate your smoking pleasure in an exclusive community. Shop right now at pravadacigarclub.com. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get in to another very interesting organized crime discussion. And on this channel, since I started it over 2 years ago, there have been two things that I've focused a lot on, one of which are mob farm teams. I have videos on many members of farm teams, including the Cafe Giannini crew, the Bath Avenue crew, and other farm teams. But one thing that I've very much done on this channel is discuss fathers and sons associated with the Mafia, the Franzises, the Gottis, the Castellanos, the Della Croce. We've heard them all. The Bonanos. There's so many. The Persicos. So many men follow their fathers into the life. Today, we are going to talk about one of the most underrated father and son teams in the history of the Mafia and the Gambino crime family. The story of Domenico and Joe Arcuri. Next on the sit down. Joseph Arcuri was born on September 22nd, 1913. He is the son of Domenico Arcuri. Now, if you're going to talk about Gambino acting boss Joe Arcuri, you have to talk about his father first. Domenico Arcuri was born way back in 1886. And according to the FBI and a file, he would say to a special agent that he came to America in and around 1900 and would settle in the Italian neighborhoods of Tampa Bay, Florida. Now, one thing that I found out through our great friends at the Button Guys and at the NewYorkMafia.com, they had a very interesting report done on longtime Trafficante underboss Frank Disidiu. Now, I know that name is a little mispronounced. That's a tough name to pronounce, but Disidiu is actually related to Domenico Arcuri. So we would have to imagine that in the time that Domenico Arcuri, when he came to the U.S., lived in Tampa, we would have to figure he was a made member of the Tampa crew or an associate of the Tampa Bay crime family. We would also know from history and according to FBI files and actual church records that Domenico Arcuri was particularly close with Santo Trafficante Sr. In fact, according to a report in 1926, and this comes directly from reports and records from the Holy Names Roman Catholic Church in Tampa, documents reflect that Santo Trafficante Jr., who was born in 1914 and was baptized in 1926, his sponsor was actually Domenico Arcuri and his wife, Felicia Longo. So essentially, Joe Arcuri's father was extremely tight with Santo Trafficante Sr. to the point that he was actually the godfather of heavyweight in the Mafia, Santo Trafficante Jr. I mean, Santo Trafficante is one of the most influential figures in the history of the American Mafia. That's how deep Domenico Arcuri goes through Frank Disidiu. So Domenico Arcuri, very connected. Now, in and around 1917, Domenico Arcuri would leave to go to New York City. Now, we don't know why he did that because he was likely in the Mafia in Tampa. He would go to New York and settle at one point on the Upper East Side. Now, Domenico Arcuri would bounce around. According to some historical records, there was at one point a connection between Domenico Arcuri and the Colombo crime family, which was back then the Profaci crime family. He would eventually come in contact with the Gambino crime family. And we don't know exactly when Domenico was made into the family, but we'd likely think it was probably the early 30s in the Mangano crime family once kind of the five families are kind of that set group and the commission is established. Domenico Arcuri would be placed into the crew of old school Gambino Capo Joseph Franco. Now, another familial connection, from what I understand, Joseph Franco and Domenico Arcuri were also related because in the later life of Joe Arcuri, he was very much involved with Sal and Joe Franco, who related to Joseph Franco, and they were identified as his nephew. So, a lot of bloodlines with the Arcuris in the mafia. Domenico was particularly strong in, we'd have to think, in the late 20s and early 20s, bootlegging, but he was also involved in gambling and other rackets. Now, according to historical record, Domenico Arcuri, up on the Upper East Side, was the proprietor of a liquor store in and around East 78th Street. In the Upper East Side. He also maintained a social club called the Victory Star Social Club, which was on 76th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenue. Now, according to historical records, the Victory Star Social Club was formed, according to New York State, in and around 1943. So by that point, he is a made member in the Gambino crime family, and his rackets are based out of that social club, the Victory Star, which, if you know anything about mob social clubs, that area of the Upper East Side was mostly Gambino territory. Joe Piney moved around up there. A couple Bonanno people moved around up there. A guy called Antonino Adamo was in and around that area, Bonanno crime family member. So Domenico Arcuri was very involved in that. Now, Joseph Arcuri, his son, was said to become a made member in the 40s. We don't have the exact date for that initiation, but Joe Arcuri goes way back because his father goes way back. Now, the Arcuris were close to Albert Anastasia, and what I find interesting is one thing we would know about Albert Anastasia is he had major issues with vices. He had a gambling problem. He was a major drinker. In fact, it was actually referenced that at one point, Albert Anastasia got, from what I understand, 4 shipments of alcohol every year from Joe and Domenico Arcuri's liquor store. In fact, up until his death in 1957, 4 months before his death, it was actually discussed that Albert Anastasia would call the Joe Arcuri liquor store 32 times. Now, while that is, we don't know. However, there was reconnaissance done, and at one point, it was scheduled that Albert Anastasia was actually going to go visit Joe Arcuri at a vacation home he had on a lake in New Jersey. So there was a very close connection between Joseph Arcuri, Domenico Arcuri, and Albert Anastasia. Now, when Albert Anastasia was whacked in 1957, the federal government would go and talk to Joe Arcuri, but they didn't get much from him. Now, one thing we would glean, though, from the assassination of Albert Anastasia was that during that time, Domenico Arcuri was involved a little bit after the fact. According to mob informant Alfred Sant'Antonio, he would say that he was given information that after Albert Anastasia was killed, Staten Island Joe Riccobono would allegedly contact Domenico Arcuri to instruct him that he was involved in some way with the hit on Albert Anastasia and that Domenico Arcuri should contact the other capos to let them know what was going on. We can gauge by the mid to late 50s, Domenico Arcuri was a capo regime in the Gambino crime family. Now, one thing I have also heard is there are rumors that once Carlo Gambino takes over in the late 50s, he elevates Arcuri to capo after he demotes Carmine Lombardozzi, who was also involved in the Joseph Franco crew. We don't exactly know who the capo or when Arcuri became the capo, but he was a very respected member, he and his son, by the late 50s. So what do we know? By the late 50s, Joe and Domenico Arcuri are both members of the Mafia, and Domenico is a capo regime in the family. And for Joseph Arcuri, he already has established a very formidable business. Now, by the late 60s, Joe Arcuri is elevated to capo regime after his father, Domenico essentially retires. Now, in 1974, Domenico Arcuri would die. Now, remember, Domenico Arcuri was born in 1886. So at the time of his death in 1974, he was nearly 90 years old. I mean, that's, again, we're dealing with people that are at the forefront of the mafia being created essentially in this country. Now, Joe Arcuri not only was involved in gambling and loan sharking operations, it was said he had a large gambling and loan business out of the Victory Star Social Club. He also was basically the basis for the Gambino crime family on the Upper East Side. It was said he was particularly close with members of the Connecticut faction of the Gambino crime family. He was cool with people in the Bonanno and Genovese crime families. And they all kind of worked out of that social club in and around 78th and 76th Street on the Upper East Side. It was also said that many high-level narcotics dealers in the mafia frequented the Victory Star Social Club. Was Joseph Arcuri in narcotics? I'm guessing probably not, but he definitely knew that people were involved, and he may have made money through it. Throughout the years of Arcuri, he was an incredibly wealthy individual. One thing that once Paul Castellano takes over in the mid-70s, one thing that Joe Arcuri was known for was racketeering, labor racketeering. In fact, Joseph Arcuri was particularly strong in the pavers union of the Laborers Association. It was said that Joseph Arcuri essentially cornered and controlled the paving union locals 1010 and 1018. In fact, it was almost exclusive that Joseph Arcuri in the 70s and 80s specialized in controlling all of the paving jobs in Manhattan and other areas of New York City. And what that allowed him to do was skim. In fact, it was said that he was the district council president of those locals. Now, eventually, what Joe Arcuri would do is he would involve the takeover of these unions, and he'd promote his nephew, Salvatore Franco, to handle the pavers union. So he and his nephew are making big money, Joe Arcuri, in the pavers union. And look, that is how you become a very rich member. That's how you become a distinguished member, a dignified guy to the mafia. One thing I notice about these old school guys like Domenico and Joe Arcuri, Arcuri was really similar to, in a way, Neil Delacroce. A lot of these old school gangsters, like the Joe Angallos, the Joe Pineys, what they are pragmatists, which means they just get in line. They don't try to make waves in the family. They just are very strong people. They continue to make money, not headlines. They're quiet people. And when the installation of new people come in, they get down. For instance, look at Domenico and Joe when their friend Albert Anastasia is killed. They don't make a big deal about it. They just go with the next regime, and they become indebted to that regime. When Carlo Gambino dies, they're subservient to Paul Castellano. And when Paul Castellano was taken out in 1985, they become subservient, Joe Arcuri, to John Gotti. Now, one thing, according I would find out to an FBI file, is Joe Arcuri was particularly involved with setting up the high-profile meetings that John Gotti would have with other capos. We would obviously see Joe Arcuri in and out of the Ravenite footage, obviously. Joe Arcuri was a distinguished guy. He was a very dignified guy. In fact, we could see him here at the funeral of John Gotti in 1992. There he can be seen with Peter Gotti and Jackie Nose. Joe Arcuri, at one point, according to the FBI, was a, quote, dignified individual and was very respectful to FBI agents whenever they would see him in and around the Upper East Side. Now, John Gotti, during his time on the street, we all know that at times John Gotti made no punches about how he felt about people. But at the end of the day, he respected all of these guys due to the money that they kicked up. We would at one point hear John Gotti call another old school guy, Joe the Cat Lafort, a name. We would hear him call him at one point like a really horrible name. But at the end of the day, he had to respect Joe the Cat. John Gotti would also say at one point that Joe Arcuri was, quote, a pain in the ass old timer. Now, he would call Joe Lafort a heartless motherfucker at one point, but he respected these guys because he knew that the wheels that turned the family were because of people like Joe Arcuri, Joe the Cat, Jimmy Brown. These guys made the Gambino crime family into the powerhouse it was in the 70s, the 80s, and even into the early 90s. Now, upon the death of John Gotti, we would find out that Joseph Arcuri was not only a high-profile member, but at one point there were reports that he would become acting boss when Gotti would go to prison in 1992. According to a report from Fox, Joe Arcuri would tell Eric Shawn a quote at one point, "It's a lot of bunk," in referring to the fact that he's the acting boss. "It's very embarrassing. Don't do it. I don't want to tell the story. I don't want to talk to anybody." Now, that was an individual who identified himself as Joe Arcuri to Fox back in the early 90s. But it was reported by law enforcement that at one point he was considered acting boss. Now, we would find out down the road that through Mikey Scars and other people that it was really a committee, quite frankly. It was Joe Arcuri. It was John Jr. Gotti. It was Jimmy Brown. Now, in 1999, Joe Arcuri was still active. According to mob informant Primo Casarino, he would say himself that when he was made in April of 1999, that Joseph Arcuri presided over his induction. Casarino would say, quote, "They told me to sit down and I sat down. Joe Arcuri asked me, 'Do you know why you're here?' I told him no," which was all a lie. "We heard good things about you," he said. "Do you want to join our secret society?" I told him, quote, "Yes." Then Arcuri would say, "Okay, put a picture of a saint in my hand." And he pricked my finger with a pin. Now, it was also stated at one point that Joe Arcuri also proceeded over the induction of Craig De Palma, the son of longtime Gambino member and Capo, Greg De Palma. So by 1999, Joe Arcuri's in his mid-80s. He's still proceeding over secret ceremonies due to the incarceration of Junior and all these different big-time guys, Jimmy Brown. So Arcuri is extremely powerful in his entire career, and he's a long lineage of gangsters that thoughts of their father. Now, in and around 2007, we can proceed that Joe Arcuri was likely retired by that point. And if he had any involvement, it was a very kind of secretive level. Joe Arcuri would die in 2007 at the age of 94. Good genes in that family. Arcuri's father lived to nearly 90. Arcuri himself lived to 94. In the over 60 years, Joe Arcuri had been in the Mafia since the late 30s, early 40s. Understand this. Joseph Arcuri never did 1 minute in jail, according to what I know and what history tells us. There's no state prison records. There's no local prison records. People like, I know Capisci reported, as far as he knows, Arcuri never spent a minute in prison. Joe Arcuri is a powerhouse, and he is a guy who will never be remembered, quite frankly, in the many pantheons of the Gambino crime family. We remember people like John Gotti and Paul Castellano, but it's people like Joe Arcuri who we should remember. A guy who is unblemished, never sat a day in prison, made a shit ton of money, and had really the most power possible in the Gambino family. I've said this time and time again. The reason the Mafia was able to be so successful is because it had many people like Joseph Arcuri. Make money, not headlines. Joe Arcuri was the complete opposite of John Gotti. And quite honestly, if when Castellano died or went to prison, let's say he wasn't killed, if people like Joseph Arcuri, Jimmy Brown, people like that kept the family moving, the Gambino family would have been the most powerful family forever. They wouldn't have had the stains of the Gottis on them at any point. Joseph Arcuri, a man's man and a respected man till the end. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, make sure you hit that like and subscribe. We'll see you next week.